All right, so I'm going to introduce our speaker. I'm really excited to have him here. We're lucky to have him. Christopher Cameron. He's an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He's also a founder and past president of the African American Intellectual History Society. He received his MA and Ph.D. In American history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research and teaching interests include early American history, the history of slavery and abolition, and American religious and intellectual history. His first book is entitled To Plead Our Own Cause, African Americans in Massachusetts and the Making of the Antislavery Movement. Was published by Kent State University Press in 2014, is out there right now. His second book coming up, entitled Black Freethinkers, A History of African American Secularism, will be published by Northwestern University, coming out in September of this year. Keep it on your list, I'll get it. My pleasure to introduce Christopher Cameron.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you to Laura Whittington for the invitation and for arranging all the small details to get me here from North Carolina. Now, I feel like there should be some great joke about a rabbi, a priest, and a black atheist walking into a bar, but I couldn't think of anything, so I guess I'll just jump right into the talk. With the celebration of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and legacy tomorrow and in the upcoming Black History Month, there will undoubtedly be a great amount of focus on the role that the Black church played in the civil rights movement and the larger Black freedom struggle. This role was significant and cannot be denied, but in tying the most important political and cultural accomplishments of African Americans to monotheistic religious orientations, both historical scholarship and popular culture ignores a small but significant group of African Americans who rejected religious beliefs and instead based their cultural production and political engagement on the principles of secular humanism. While I cannot do complete justice to the vital tradition of African American Freethought in 35 to 40 minutes, I would like to briefly outline its historical trajectory, ideological suppositions, and major goals for advancing the causes of social justice and racial equality. So I'll begin with some background on the origins of Black Freethought during the 19th century, before discussing the many ways that secularism intersected with the long civil rights movement of the 20th century. So African American Freethought arose in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Unlike the Enlightenment origins of Freethought among white intellectuals such as Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, Black Freethought grew out of the institution of slavery and the conditions that blacks endured within it. The increased evangelism to slaves that characterized the Second Great Awakening of the early 19th century also brought to the fore what many saw to be the hypocritical nature of their Christian masters, including the very practice of holding slaves itself, but also the way that their masters treated them. One of the key reasons that African Americans embraced Freethought during the 19th century was an inability to resolve the problem of evil, or the question of how we reconcile the existence of evil in the world with the presence of a supposedly benevolent and omnipotent deity. And for many slaves, of course, the problem of evil was intimately related to their daily lives, as really probably the central component of slavery was suffering. Now, many slaves did find meaning in religion, whether monotheistic ones such as Christianity or African-derived traditions such as conjure, but others rejected religion altogether. The historian Al Rabateau notes that the meaning many slaves found in religion was not so much an answer to the problem of suffering as the acceptance of the sorrow and joy inherent in the human condition and an affirmation that life itself was valuable. But many slaves did not believe that a life under slavery was valuable under any conditions, and they needed an answer to the problem of evil before they could accept the idea of a God. When this answer did not come, they embraced atheism as the only logical solution to the problem of evil. Another key development that fostered the growth of African American atheism was pro-slavery religion, right? So one prominent black agnostic during the 19th century, enslaved man who gained his freedom, wrote an autobiography named William Wells Brown. He wrote that he never took his master's prayer sessions seriously because of, quote, slavery's evangelical bloodhounds and its religious slaveholders. Another former slave named Henry Bibb notes of white preachers in his slave narrative that the slaves, with but few exceptions, have no confidence at all in their preaching because they preach a pro-slavery doctrine. They say, "Servants, be obedient to your masters, and he that knoweth his master's will and doeth it not shall be beaten with many stripes." Most slaves feel they are destined to die in bondage unless they are delivered by some deity, Bibb notes, but when that does not happen, they cannot believe or trust in such a religion. Now, aside from the freethinker Frederick Douglass, what we usually see during the era of slavery among many blacks was not necessarily secular humanism, but rather atheism and agnosticism. And this is because of their conditions under slavery, right? It's hard to have this sort of outward activist orientation when you can't even get yourself out of bondage, right? But for those slaves who did, run away, gain their freedom, folks like Frederick Douglass and William Wells Brown, you do see them becoming active and prominent participants in the 19th century anti-slavery movement as well as the women's rights movement. Now, Freethought would start to sort of grow and transform and really coalesce among African Americans during the early 20th century, right? And the Harlem Renaissance represents sort of a great kind of flourishing of black Freethought. The Harlem Renaissance had its roots in the Great Migration to the north, whereby you saw a number of African Americans, 1.5 million between 1914 and 1930, moving from areas in the rural South to the urban North, cities like Detroit, Milwaukee, Chicago, and New York City, in order to escape racism in the South, sharecropping, which kept a number of African Americans in cycles of perpetual debt. So this Great Migration was one sort of foundation of the Harlem Renaissance, but another was the Red Scare and backlash, racist backlash from a number of whites after World War I. So one development that you saw with black soldiers coming home from World War I was race riots in a number of cities throughout the United States, right? And this sort of indirectly led to the Harlem Renaissance in that it pushed a lot of African Americans to start looking for kind of cultural approaches to solving the problems of racism rather than sort of overt political organizing, which could lead to some of that mob violence, right? So the Harlem Renaissance would be this great period of the flourishing of American freethought and African American freethought, and you really see secular themes cropping up in the work of a number of different writers, including Langston Hughes, right? Nella Larsen was another really important one. Nella Larsen had been born in 1891 in Chicago. She attended college at Fisk University in Tennessee, moved around quite a bit. She worked at Tuskegee Institute, which was founded by Booker T. Washington, and ended up in Harlem in the late 19-teens, early 1920s, and she worked at the branch of the New York Public Library on 135th Street, what's now known as the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. And after getting her position there, she started to publish a little bit more, and in 1928, she published her short novel, Quicksand. And Quicksand is, most reviewers and most critics argue that it's basically an autobiographical novel that represents Nella Larsen's life and her travels and her ideas. And Quicksand represents and contains really the greatest exploration of freethought in African-American literature up until that time. There had certainly been a number of other freethinkers, and you see some of these secular themes in like Langston Hughes's poetry, but Quicksand was really probably the most extensive discussion of freethought. It features a mixed-race woman named Helga Crane, and the novel starts out with her experiences at Naxos University, which is a composite of Fisk and Tuskegee. And right from the beginning of the novel, Helga Crane is articulating her dissatisfaction with Christianity, right, with being forced to listen to a white preacher come in and tell blacks not to really push too hard for political equality and to sort of be happy with their station in life, right? Now, after a number of different travels and experiences, Helga Crane ends up marrying a revival preacher that she meets in Harlem, a man named the Reverend Mr. Pleasant Green. And so she meets him in Harlem where he's conducting a revival service, ends up making a rash decision to marry him, and then moves down to his rural Alabama town where he was a preacher, has 4 kids in 3 years, 1 set of twins, and after the 4th kid, she realizes she made the biggest mistake of her life in marrying this man. And it also sort of symbolizes her acceptance of Christianity, right? Towards the end of the novel, Larsen writes, with the obscuring curtain of religion rent, she was able to look about her and see with shocked eyes this thing she had done to herself. She couldn't, she thought ironically, even blame God for it, now that she knew he didn't exist. No more than she could pray to him for the death of her husband, the Reverend Mr. Pleasant Green, the white man's God and his great love for all people regardless of race. What idiotic nonsense she had allowed herself to believe, right? So a common theme in this period among Larsen, Langston Hughes, and others was that God was not doing anything to help black people. So why should they believe, right? Another prominent black freethinker of this era who you've probably read or at least encountered her work at some point was Zora Neale Hurston. Now, I read Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God in middle school, again in high school. Nobody ever told me that she was a secularist or that she was a religious skeptic, right? And in fact, Hurston's autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road, which was first published in the early 1940s, her discussion of her ideas about religion and her critiques of religion were actually omitted from that autobiography until the 1970s when Alice Walker sort of rediscovered her works. So the publisher decided to kind of keep that out, probably because he thought that they thought it wouldn't sell among African Americans, right? Now, Hurston grew up in the all-black town of Eatonville, Florida. She moved to Harlem in the early to mid-1920s. She attended Columbia University, where she studied anthropology and history with Franz Bois. And her autobiography reveals the influence of philosophers like Ludwig Feuerbach, right, whose work argued in the 19th century that basically we create God, right? God is sort of a mental projection of us. He argued this in the essence of Christianity. Her work also shows the influence of Friedrich Nietzsche, right, in that she argues basically that only weak people need religion, right? She says she doesn't pray because why would she need to? Now, Hurston was kind of skirted the line between agnosticism and deism, right? She left room for the possibility of an existence of a God. She just didn't think it was necessary for her to believe in or to rely on, right? Now, while some African Americans eschewed overt politics due to this white backlash that I mentioned, others did embrace it. And during roughly the same time as the Harlem Renaissance, you see more and more African Americans joining ranks with the socialists and communists. A couple key reasons for this development. One, communists were very sort of vocal and open in their support of the Scottsboro Boys in the early 1930s, right? A number of African Americans who had been unjustly accused of rape, sort of a common thing during this time period, and they, organized funds for their legal defense, right? Also, at least ideologically, socialists and communists were interested in building sort of interracial alliances based on class, right, rather than alliances based on particular races. And also, a number of leading black socialists and communists in the United States had actually been exposed to socialism back in the Caribbean, right? So West Indian activists and intellectuals were among some of the most prominent early black communists. So some of the leading African-American socialists and communists during the 1920s and 1930s were individuals like Louise Thompson Patterson, pictured here. Hubert Harrison was another, and he represents sort of this West Indian influence. Harry Haywood was another, as well as W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Hubert Harrison was perhaps, the leading socialist thinker in the 19-teens and 1920s. Harrison immigrated to New York City from the Caribbean in 1901, and really saw himself as something of an apostle of Freethought to African Americans, right? In Hubert Harrison, you start to see a greater engagement with the writings of white freethinkers among African Americans, right? So Hubert Harrison, read Thomas Paine and others, and really tried to sort of popularize their ideas among African Americans. And Harrison also engaged with the broader Freethought movement of his time period, right? Attending Freethought gatherings, publishing articles in The Truth Seeker, right? The leading Freethought publication of the day. And again, with him, you start to see how early American deists, right, are playing a really influential role among 20th century black freethinkers, something that would be replicated in the 1960s with folks like Eldridge Cleaver and Huey Newton. Another leading sort of black socialist and freethinker of this time period was Richard Wright. Now, Richard Wright grew up in rural Mississippi before moving first to Chicago in the late 1920s, then to Harlem, and then he would move on and travel around sort of the Atlantic world, living in France for a number of years. Now, Wright's autobiography, at least in the first part of his autobiography, really the central theme of this is his sort of growing distaste with and rejection of Christianity, right? So he was living with his grandmother in Mississippi, who was very religious. His aunt was a Seventh-day Adventist who also lived with him. And his autobiography, Black Boy, just narrates his sort of constant and continual struggles with these two influences in his life and with Christianity, right? Now, later on, when Wright moved to Chicago, this is where he became a communist would eventually move away from communism and embrace existentialism. And existentialism would be really influential in his novel The Outsider, published in 1953. This novel features a black atheist named Cross Damon that was replete with existentialist themes. And I think it's really significant not only in his sort of engagement with European philosophy, right, and in having this black male atheist as the sort of central character of this novel, but also in reading the reviews and the critiques of The Outsider by other black writers. One of the things you see if you read these reviews is that a number of black intellectuals and black writers basically rejected Wright's The Outsider. He had published his most famous novel, Native Son, to great acclaim, but a few years later they reject The Outsider really because of its existentialism. And they say things like, Wright has spent too much time in France, he's sort of out of touch with the realities of black life in America. And what these do are they kind of contribute to the idea that African Americans are naturally religious and God-fearing people, right? Existentialism, atheism, those are white things. Those aren't things that we should be exploring in African American literature. Now, one figure that really sort of kind of connects or is a bridge between basically everybody that I'll talk about today is W.E.B. Du Bois, right? So he was born in 1968, just 3 years after the end of slavery. Was a participant and somebody who really helped to forward the Harlem Renaissance, also was very politically radical and became sort of much more so over the course of his life, right, and would contribute to what's traditionally seen as the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Now, in discussions of Du Bois, few focus on his agnosticism, right? But Du Bois notes in his autobiography that he became a freethinker while he was a student in Germany in the late 19th century, right? And he published a number of articles in The Crisis, the organ of the NAACP, during the 19-teens that were highly critical of both black and white preachers and of Christianity in general, right? And in a number of writings, his opposition to Christianity is really a key theme. And for him and for Wright and others, opposition to Christianity really intersects with their socialism and with their communism, right? Because they argue that Christianity and capitalism were sort of the twin poles that were keeping not only African Americans, but minority peoples around the world in subjugation, right? That Christianity and capitalism helped to justify imperialism around the world and racism here in the United States. So moving into what is traditionally seen as the civil rights movement, and I say traditionally because the civil rights movement was not just, Rosa Parks up until 1965, right? The civil rights movement was a long movement for racial equality and political equality that stretched back to the early 20th century and went beyond the 1960s, right? The 50s and 60s are sort of the most well-known parts of this movement, but none of the work that none of the achievements that came about in the 1960s would have been possible without the ground being laid by activists in the 20s, 30s, and the 1940s. Now, the civil rights movement is traditionally portrayed as a religious movement, right? And this is because of the prominence of figures like Martin Luther King Jr. But the reality is that when we actually look at, say, how many churches actively participated in civil rights organizing, it was a very small minority, right? Less than 10% of churches actually engaged in civil rights organizing. Now, For some, this was due to fear of racist backlash, right? But for others, it was simple conservatism, right, on the part of some of these churches. If the civil rights movement isn't as sort of religiously dominated as we traditionally think, then what played a role, right? What were some of the sources of civil rights ideology? Well, I argue in my book, Black Freethinkers, that secularism played a primary role in the ideas, the organizing, the strategies, and some of the major accomplishments of both the civil rights movement and of Black Power, the Black Power movement, which would emerge in the mid-1960s, right? So just as in earlier periods, Black freethinkers were central players in civil rights during the 1960s, and this is especially evident in the Black Power movement. Now, Black Power emerged out of the civil rights activity of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1966. SNCC had been created in 1960 and was initially led by Christian activists such as John Lewis, who was committed to the philosophy of nonviolence. But the philosophy and approach of SNCC soon started to change, especially after James Forman became the organization's executive secretary. Now, like Richard Wright, Forman had grown up in rural Mississippi and had also started moving away from religion as a young man. Now, in a scene repeated in many autobiographies and memoirs of Black freethinkers, Forman writes in his autobiography, The Making of Black Revolutionaries, that at the age of 12, he was attending a revival service, and some of his friends yelled out that they had gotten religion. The older people shouted that they had got religion too, he writes. At the age of 12, in a Baptist tradition and setting, I did not have the courage to tell my grandmother that I thought this was all nonsense. I simply observed what had been happening around me and knew that I, too, could fabricate some tears in this emotionally charged atmosphere. So I covered my face with my handkerchief and cried, "Lord, have mercy." It worked. I was taken off the mourner's bench, and people talked of how many children got saved that day by the grace of the Lord. You see this again and again in the memoirs of Black atheists, right? In Zora Neale Hurston's, in Langston Hughes's autobiography, The Big C. Ironically enough, the moment that they're supposed to become Christian, when they're on the mourner's bench, is the moment when they sort of see behind the veil and become atheists. Now, Forman became an atheist after studying philosophy at Wilson Junior College. He had been sort of on the road to atheism, but this sort of solidified it for him. He became the executive secretary of SNCC in 1963 and grounded his activism in secular humanism, as he believed that Christianity was a prime reason that blacks were in a subordinate position in the United States. Now, in 1966, Forman, along with Stokely Carmichael, helped lead the transition of SNCC from a religious to a secular organization and inaugurated the Black Power movement. The major goals of Black Power were promoting Black economic advancement, pride in Black culture, independent Black political action, and armed self-reliance, or rejection of nonviolence. Now, Forman was the earliest proponent of Black Power, but the man that would sort of become most associated with the movement is Stokely Carmichael, pictured here. Carmichael was an immigrant from Trinidad who had grown up in the Bronx, where he attended the prestigious Bronx High School of Science. His best friend there was a Jewish kid named Gene Dennis, whose father worked for the Communist Party. And at Bronx Science, Carmichael began attending meetings of the Young Communist League and quickly embraced atheism, right? A perspective that he would bring to his civil rights work in the 1960s and in ensuing decades. Now, Black Power started out as sort of an ideology, right? And the main institutional expression, even though it began in SNCC, the main institutional expression of Black power would eventually become the Black Panther Party for self-defense, or just the Black Panther Party. Now, the Black Panthers were explicitly a secular organization, right? And they created it to sort of fulfill some of the main goals of Black power, right? Promoting pride in Black culture, promoting independent Black political action. Some of the activities that they would engage in, probably their most well-known one was a free breakfast program for children. They would also operate clinics throughout the country, right? They had an ambulance service, right, in rural areas to get African Americans to hospitals and to medical care. And really, they were just an organization aimed at uplifting African Americans in many different ways, right? Now, many prominent leaders of the Black Panther Party, including Huey Newton, Stokely Carmichael, David Hilliard, and Eldridge Cleaver, were very outspoken in their atheism, right? Like earlier thinkers, they saw the church as conservative, and they advanced a humanist politics that rejected the authority of what they derisively termed Uncle Tom bootlicking preachers. You see this in like all of their speeches, right? Now, the Black Panther Party was the political expression of Black power. Its sort of literary and intellectual expression is known as the Black Arts Movement, which lasted roughly a decade, from the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s. Writers of the Black Arts Movement had multiple goals: promoting and articulating Black pride, Black nationalism, and rejecting respectability politics. This latter goal went hand in hand with for some with a rejection of Christianity, right? And one of the key figures in the Black Arts Movement would be James Baldwin. Baldwin rejected religion because he viewed it as otherworldly and unsuited to addressing the problems of Black people in America. In his autobiographical work, The Fire Next Time, published in 1963, Baldwin notes that he had become a teenage preacher in Harlem during the early 1940s, and that even after being a preacher for 3 years, or perhaps because he had been a preacher for 3 years, he writes, "The blood of the Lamb had not cleansed me in any way whatever. I was just as black as I had been the day I was born. Therefore, when I faced a congregation, it began to take all the strength I had not to stammer, not to curse, not to tell them to throw away their Bibles and get off their knees and go home and organize, for example, a rent strike." Now, Baldwin was one of the most popular and widely read Black authors of the 1960s, and multiple works, including The Fire Next Time, Blues for Mr. Charlie, and Go Tell It on the Mountain, demonstrate the influence of his rejection of Christianity. Now, along with Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry was an important part of the Black Arts Movement, and another writer whose secularism heavily influenced her literature. Hansberry had been born in Chicago in 1930 and moved to Harlem in the 1950s, where she worked with W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson on the anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist magazine entitled Freedom. Hansberry is most well known for her play A Raisin in the Sun. The play is set in the south side of Chicago sometime between the end of World War II and 1959. It focuses on the Younger family after the death of the patriarch, Walter Younger Sr. The family is waiting on $10,000 in life insurance money, and much of the drama revolves around what will be done with the funds. Walter Younger Jr. would like Mama to give him the money to invest in a liquor store, while Mama wants to use the money to buy a house in a white neighborhood and support the medical career of her daughter, Benitha. Now, Benitha is a modern woman who embraces feminism, anti-colonialism, and atheism. While many people urge her to marry her middle-class suitor George Murchison, she decides to wait until her schooling is complete, putting her career ahead of middle-class domesticity. And when Mama remarks to her that she will be a doctor if God wills it, Benita replies, "God hasn't got a thing to do with it." She goes on to express her frustration that God gets all the credit for human achievements, asking whether or not God would be paying her tuition. Now, Mama's incredulous at this statement, noting that she took her and Walter to church every Sunday and that Benita had not been brought up to speak disrespectfully about God. "Mama, you don't understand. It's all a matter of ideas, and God is just one idea I don't accept. It's not important. I'm not going out and being immoral or committing crimes because I don't believe in God. It's just that I get tired of him getting credit for all the things the human race achieves through its own effort. There's simply no blasted God. There's only man, and it is he who makes miracles." Now, Benita expresses Hansberry's own sentiments. As she noted in an interview with Mike Wallace shortly after the play came out, "Benita is me, 8 years ago." For Hansberry, human beings had the capacity for morality through the use of reason and did not need to believe in God in order to be good people. And when human beings achieve something in the world, we should recognize them rather than attribute their accomplishments to an unseen deity. "We don't need mysticism to exalt man," she claimed in one interview. "Man exalts himself by his achievements and his power to rationalize and reason." Her perspective on religion was similar to that of Zora Neale Hurston, as articulated in Dust Tracks on a Road, namely that we attribute to God the aspects of nature and human life that we do not understand. Unlike Hurston, Hansberry did not see this as a weakness, but rather a strength of human beings. It was just a strength that she felt she didn't need. So, despite views of African Americans as naturally religious, Freethought has been a vital and significant component of Black politics and culture since the 19th century. It's never been incredibly widespread, although the number of Black freethinkers has doubled over the past 2 decades. But as you can see from some of the individuals I've mentioned, it's been prominent among some of the literary, intellectual, and political giants in African American life and history, right? Now, the history of Black Freethought is really not an obscure one, right? Sources on Black freethinkers are readily available in print and online, right? And for my chapter on slavery in Black Freethought, most of the sources I found came from Doc South, which is an online repository of slave narratives hosted by UNC Chapel Hill, right? Also, a lot of my sources are poetry, right, novels, autobiographies, many of which have been published. They're not out of print or anything like that. All it takes is kind of looking for them. And I think it's really vital to understand and to teach this history in order to show Black skeptics today that they are part of a long tradition of prominent Black freethinkers. Thank you very much.
We're going to have a quick Q&A session, 10 minutes, gleaned from the questions that we have written on the back of the program. So questions will come from our 2 moderators here, and I'll have the speaker come up.
Okay, I'll go first. Is there any evidence that difficult circumstances such as poverty and slavery increase or decrease the tendency towards religion?
Yes, I mean, certainly slavery. I talked a bit about that. And poverty as well, right? This is just one of the sort of general critiques that African Americans had with American institutions, right? Governmental, private as well. I think for many African Americans, especially for Black intellectuals and freethinkers, part of the reason that so many Black people were in poverty was because of racism, capitalism, in Christianity, right? That these three sort of intersected to keep blacks in a subordinate position. So yeah, I think both of those are very much tied to black free thought.
Did James Baldwin's homosexuality have anything to do with his rejection of God, in your opinion?
Yes, I think it did. Partially because he wouldn't have felt comfortable, right, in any Christian churches. Now, I note that Baldwin was an atheist. He never completely sort of disentangled himself from black religious life, and this is the case for a lot of freethinkers, right? So you have folks like Langston Hughes, Baldwin, and others who personally were skeptical, right? But you still see kind of religious themes kind of cropping up in their writing. You still see, for example, somebody like A. Philip Randolph, who was an agnostic and a socialist, organizing meetings in black churches, right? So, yeah, Baldwin rejected religion. I think it was partially based on questions of sexuality and acceptance and belonging in the black church. And that's actually the case for a lot of black freethinkers today, right? Is not really feeling comfortable in traditional evangelical black churches and are moving out of those into more maybe independent churches, but some are moving out of the church altogether.
Is there any evidence that Martin Luther King Jr. ever questioned his faith?
I haven't studied King extensively. I'm absolutely certain that he questioned his faith, right? I think all, religious people do question their faith. He never, became a freethinker or anything like that. But I'm sure he questioned and had doubts, especially at times where, maybe he thought he had made some progress and then, some African American was lynched or killed in an act of racist violence. I'm sure those periods forced him to question his faith, but they never sort of pushed him to atheism or agnosticism.
I got two questions that were extremely similar, so I'm combining them into one. What about today? Who are the black freethinkers and authors and cultural icons that are currently active?
So one of the interesting developments in black free thought today is that it's less prominent among sort of leading African Americans, but it's more widespread among ordinary black people, right? So, for example, there are very few African American politicians who openly identify as atheist or agnostic, even if they might privately believe that, simply because it would be political suicide, right? Close to something like 89% of African Americans still identify as religious, right? So there aren't a lot of prominent black politicians, but of leading black freethinkers, there's a local one here, Anthony Pinn, who teaches at Rice University, Mandisa Thomas, the founder of Black Nonbelievers, Inc., which began in Atlanta, I believe has a chapter here in Houston, Detroit, there's one in Charlotte where I live. And Sikivu Hutchinson is another really prominent sort of cultural critic and freethinker who a lot of her work is geared towards finding strategies and finding ways especially to bring more black women into the free thought fold. Yep, I mentioned him, yep.
Why are today's evangelical black churches so in step with the right?
I don't believe that's true. I think African American evangelicals are by and large socially conservative, so some of their social values might intersect with the politics of the right, including in opposition to abortion, opposition to gay marriage. But those kind of social and religious values, generally speaking, do not translate into political conservatism, right? So while black evangelicals might share some of the same kind of theological ideals as white evangelicals, they're still staunchly committed to racial justice. And they don't see the political right as kind of sharing that really fundamental value.
What has been the toughest part about being outspoken about black secularism? Have you received any kind of backlash or in being outspoken about black secularism?
I mean, I haven't, but I'm not like Anthony Pinn or Sekivu Hutchinson in that I'm not like a black Freethought leader or anything like that. Like I'm part of Black Non-Believers of Charlotte, and I study black Freethought, but for people seeing stuff that I post, it's very academic, right? I publish in sort of traditional academic journals and with academic presses. So I think for me that provides a little bit of cover, right? People don't really kind of question whether it's my beliefs or if it's something that I'm just exploring for academic purposes. I think what might also provide me some cover is that I wrote a book about basically black Puritans. So they're like, oh, he's just interested in black religious thought, whether it's secularism or Puritanism or whatnot. But I also have a sort of particular privilege as a black male, right? For black women, it's much harder to be open about their secularism because there's that expectation that women are going to be sort of passing down the religious values to the next generation, right? It's more acceptable, generally speaking, for white men and for black men to be secular, right? And to be sort of open about that.
I don't have any more questions.
Oh, okay. I think we have time for one more. And I guess this ties into our last couple of questions. Is there anything currently being done to promote free thought among African Americans?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Anthony Pinn's work is some of the most important. He just published, I think a couple of years ago, a short little book called When Colorblindness Isn't the Answer that really speaks to some strategies that free thought organizations with few African Americans can start to employ to bring more blacks in, right? But then you also have groups like Black Skeptics of Los Angeles that Sekivu Hutchinson organized, Black Non-Believers, Black Atheists of America, that are doing really important work to try to sort of broaden the tent of black free thought. My particular contribution to this is kind of scholarly, but I think it can be an important one in showing contemporary black freethinkers that they're sort of not alone, right? That there's nothing sort of off the wall about becoming an atheist or an agnostic, and that some of the most important individuals in African American culture and African American history have embraced free thought, so maybe it's okay for them to do so today.
Will you be able to join us for lunch and continue to answer
course.
questions?
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.